The flames that consumed Redemption Farm on November 15, 1902, burned so bright they could be seen from 3 counties away. But what made the fire truly extraordinary wasn't its intensity, it was the silence that followed. No investigation, no inquiry, no questions asked about the 12 girls who had vanished without a trace. Just days before the blaze, the authorities called it an electrical malfunction. The newspapers called it a tragic accident. The survivors, what few there were, called it something else entirely. If you're new here, welcome to Stories the World Buried Deep, told quietly and without sensationalism. If that's something you value, please subscribe and drop a comment to let us know where you're listening from, because these places may seem distant, but they existed in the heart of America, hiding horrors behind stained glass windows and scripture verses. Today we're going back to the Missouri countryside, to a place where wayward girls were sent to be redeemed, where redemption meant something far darker than salvation, and where the earth still refuses to forget what was buried beneath its surface. This is the story of Redemption Farm and the fire that finally set the truth free. The year was 1879, and America was grappling with what the newspapers called the girl problem. Industrialization had driven families from farms to cities. Traditional structures were crumbling. Young women were working in factories, reading novels, and worst of all, thinking for themselves. The moral authorities of the day declared this a crisis that threatened the very fabric of Christian society. Enter Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield, a Methodist preacher from Springfield, Missouri, who claimed to have received a divine vision. God, he said, had shown him a solution, a place where fallen angels could be taught to fly again, where the moral contamination of modern life could be purged from young souls through prayer, labor, and what he called corrective love. In the spring of 1880, Thornfield purchased 84.7 acres of rolling farmland in Jasper County, Missouri. The deed listed the property as Thornfield Agricultural Seminary for wayward youth, but locals quickly began calling it by another name, Redemption Farm. The timing wasn't coincidental. Just months earlier, Missouri had passed the Dependent Children Protection Act, which allowed for the indefinite placement of morally endangered girls in state-approved institutions. The criteria for moral endangerment were deliberately vague. A girl could be committed for anything from theft to reading inappropriate literature to what one intake form described as excessive familiarity with boys. Thornfield positioned himself perfectly to capitalize on this legal framework. He cultivated relationships with judges, social workers, and church leaders across the state. He spoke at conferences about the spiritual benefits of agricultural work for wayward youth. He published pamphlets with titles like Tilling the Soul, Agriculture as Moral Medicine, and The Sacred Harvest, Gathering Lost Lambs. By 1881, Redemption Farm was receiving state funding. By 1882, it was operating at full capacity with 89 girls in residence. And by 1883, troubling reports were beginning to surface. A letter from a mother in Kansas City, published in a Methodist newsletter, asked why her daughter hadn't been allowed to visit home for Christmas, despite completing her corrective term. A social worker from Louis filed a report questioning why several girls from her caseload had been transferred to other facilities without explanation. A newspaper editor in Springfield received an anonymous tip about unusual supply deliveries to the farm, medical equipment and chemicals not typically associated with agricultural education. But these concerns were quickly dismissed. Thornfield had powerful allies, and his public image was carefully crafted. Redemption Farm hosted annual harvest festivals that drew visitors from across the region. Photographs showed smiling girls in neat pinafores, tending gardens and attending chapel services. Testimonial letters, supposedly written by grateful former residents, praised the firm, but loving guidance that had set them on righteous paths. What these carefully staged images didn't show were the locked dormitories, the isolation cells, or the mysterious southern wing of the main building that was always kept off limits to visitors. Most crucially, they didn't show the girls who never made it to the photograph session, the ones who had been quietly transferred to what Thornfield called specialized treatment in the farm's hidden facilities. Because Redemption Farm was never just about moral correction. From the very beginning, it was something far more sinister, a testing ground for theories about genetic inferiority, racial purity, and the perfectibility of the human race, through controlled breeding and selective elimination. The signs were there from the start, hidden in plain sight within Thornfield's own writings. In a 1882 sermon titled Weeding the Garden of Humanity, he spoke about the difference between souls that could be saved and those that were inherently corrupt. He referenced the new science of heredity, the work of European theorists who claimed certain bloodlines carried moral defects that could be passed down through generations. Most disturbing of all, he spoke about the sacred duty to prune the human tree so that future generations might grow strong and pure. This wasn't just religious zealotry, this was eugenics wrapped in the language of salvation. The main building of Redemption Farm was constructed in the summer of 1880, but the blueprints revealed a structure unlike any other agricultural seminary in the state. While most similar institutions were built with open dormitories and communal spaces designed to foster rehabilitation through community, Redemption Farm was designed for isolation and control. The building plans, discovered in 2019 during a routine transfer of county records, show a 3-story brick structure with several unusual features. The first floor contained the chapel, dining hall, and administrative offices, all designed to impress visitors. But the upper floors told a different story. The second floor was divided into what the plans labeled classification dormitories. Girls were housed not by age or offense, but by what Thornfield called their redemption potential. Dormitory A housed girls classified as temporarily wayward, those from good families who had simply fallen into bad habits. Dormitory B was for morally susceptible girls, who required firmer guidance. Dormitory C, at the far end of the building, was for those deemed fundamentally corrupted. The girls in Dormitory C lived under conditions that would have been considered harsh even by 19th century standards. Cells instead of rooms, meals taken in isolation, exercise limited to 1 hour daily in a walled courtyard, and most concerning of all, regular medical evaluations, conducted by the farm's resident physician. The third floor was the most mysterious. According to the plans, it contained what were labeled simply as treatment rooms, a medical laboratory, and living quarters for but testimonies from the few survivors suggest the third floor served a far darker purpose. Martha Whitmore, who lived at Redemption Farm from 1884 to 1886, before being transferred to another facility, gave a deathbed confession in 1947 that would later prove crucial to understanding what really happened at the farm. In her testimony, recorded by a Methodist minister but not made public until 1987, she described the third floor as a place where girls went to have their minds quieted. They would take you up there if you caused too much trouble, she recalled, or if you tried to tell people about what really went on. Dr. Caldwell had machines up there, strange contraptions with wires and leather straps. He said they could cure wickedness by adjusting the electrical impulses in the brain. Martha's description of Dr. Deus Caldwell aligns with other fragmentary records. Caldwell was not a licensed physician, but rather a self-taught practitioner who had studied what he called neural rehabilitation at several European clinics. His theories about the electrical nature of moral behavior were considered radical, even by the standards of early psychiatric medicine. Caldwell believed that moral defects were caused by irregularities in the brain's electrical pattern. Using primitive electroshock devices of his own design, he claimed he could rewire a girl's moral circuitry, making her naturally inclined toward obedience and virtue. The treatment was, according to Martha's testimony, indescribably brutal. You'd hear them screaming from the first floor, she remembered, and when they brought the girls back down, they were different, quiet, empty. They'd stare at nothing for hours. Some never spoke again. But the third floor wasn't just about punishment, it was also about experimentation. Recent analysis of water samples from the farm's old well revealed unusually high levels of mercury, arsenic and several compounds that wouldn't be identified until decades later. Chemical analysis suggests these substances were being used in some kind of systematic program, possibly related to Caldwell's theories about altering brain chemistry through controlled poisoning. A ledger discovered in the basement of a demolished Springfield medical building in 2003 contained what appeared to be Caldwell's research notes. The entries, written in a cramped, nearly illegible hand, describe various experimental compounds and their effects on female subjects of different ages and racial backgrounds. One entry from October 1885 reads, Subject 47, Irish-German heritage, age 16, admitted for moral turpitude, administered compound 7, mercury chloride with belladonna extract, daily for 2 weeks. Subject shows decreased verbal resistance but increased motor agitation. Recommend transition to restraint therapy. Another, dated March 1886, Subject 12, Negro white heritage, age 14, admitted for theft, and defiance. Compound 12 arsenic with laudanum, proving effective for behavioral modification. Subject now completely compliant. Appetite decreased but obedience absolute. Excellent candidate for breeding program evaluation. The reference to a breeding program is particularly chilling, because it suggests that Redemption Farm was part of a larger eugenic scheme. Girls who survived the initial treatment phase were apparently being evaluated for their potential contribution to what Thornfield called the purification of the American bloodline. This theory is supported by another discovery made in 2007, when renovation work on a barn near the original farm site uncovered a hidden room containing dozens of detailed medical records. These files, dating from 1883 to 1895, documented extensive physical examinations of the girls, with particular attention paid to their reproductive health, family histories, and what the Thorns called hereditary defects. Each file was marked with a classification: suitable for rehabilitation and placement, suitable for controlled breeding, or unsuitable, recommend sterilization or elimination. Of the 47 girls documented in these files, 89 were classified as suitable for rehabilitation, 24 were marked for controlled breeding, and 34 were deemed unsuitable. None of the girls in the unsuitable category appear in any discharge records. They simply vanished from the official documentation, as if they had never existed at all. But they had existed, and as we'll see, some of them found ways to leave evidence of their presence that would survive long after the flames consumed Redemption Farm. Reverend Ezekiel Thornfield wasn't a man you'd immediately suspect of harboring dark secrets. Contemporary photographs show a tall, lean figure with kind eyes and a gentle smile, dressed in the simple black suit of a Methodist minister. His sermons, several of which survive in the archives of the Springfield Theological Seminary, are filled with references to mercy, redemption, and the infinite love of God for even the most wayward soul. But like many dangerous men, Thornfield's evil was hidden beneath a carefully constructed facade of righteousness. Born in 1834 to a farming family in rural Tennessee, Thornfield experienced what his authorized biography called a spiritual awakening during the Civil War. Serving as a chaplain with Confederate forces, he claimed to have received divine visions about the future of American Christianity. In these visions, he said, God revealed to him that the nation's moral fabric was under attack by foreign influences, immigrants, Catholics, and what he termed the mongrel races. According to Thornfield's private journals, discovered in a storage unit in 1998, his real awakening came not from God but from his exposure to the racial theories of European scientists. During the war, he had encountered Confederate officers who spoke admiringly of German research into heredity and racial classification. These ideas took root in his mind, eventually flowering into the twisted theology that would drive his work at Redemption Farm.
Leaders, scientists, and social reformers who saw institutions for wayward youth as laboratories for testing eugenic theories. The day-to-day operations of Redemption Farm were overseen by Thornfield's hand-picked staff, each chosen for their willingness to embrace his radical vision of moral correction. The farm's matron was Mrs. Constance Whitmore, a widow from St. Louis, who had previously managed a workhouse for destitute women. Whitmore was known for her strict disciplinary methods and her belief that physical suffering was necessary for spiritual growth. Under her supervision, the girls' daily routine was rigidly controlled, with every moment from dawn to dusk scheduled and monitored. The morning bell rang at 4. The girls had 15 minutes to dress and make their beds before morning chapel, where they recited scripture verses and listened to brief sermons about the importance of obedience and humility. Breakfast was served at 6:00 a.m., usually thin gruel, bread and milk. The portions were deliberately small, based on Thornfield's belief that hunger made young women more tractable. From 7:00 a.m. to 5:00 p.m., the girls worked in the fields or workshops, with brief breaks for water and a simple lunch. The work was backbreaking, harvesting crops, tending livestock, washing laundry, sewing garments and maintaining the buildings and grounds. The girls worked in silence, supervised by staff members who carried leather straps and were authorized to inflict immediate punishment for any infraction. Evening chapel began at 6:00 a.m., followed by a dinner that was slightly more substantial than breakfast but still deliberately inadequate. The girls were expected to express gratitude for their meal and their opportunity for moral rehabilitation. Any complaint about the food, the work, or the conditions resulted in immediate punishment. Lights out was at 8:00 p.m., but sleep was often impossible. The dormitories were overcrowded, poorly heated, and deliberately uncomfortable. Girls slept on thin straw mattresses with coarse wool blankets that were washed infrequently. The windows were barred and kept locked, making the rooms stuffy and airless. But the physical hardships were only the beginning. Thornfield had developed what he called a graduated system of moral correction that was designed to break down a girl's individual will and remake her into what he considered an ideal Christian woman. The first stage was humiliation. New arrivals were stripped of their personal belongings, given shapeless grey uniforms, and assigned numbers instead of names. They were required to confess their sins publicly during chapel services, often fabricating transgressions if their actual offenses were deemed insufficient. The goal was to convince them that they were fundamentally corrupt and deserving of punishment. The second stage was isolation. Girls who showed signs of resistance or leadership were separated from the general population and placed in solitary confinement. The isolation cells were located in the basement of the main building, windowless rooms, barely large enough for a single cot and a bucket. Girls could be kept in isolation for weeks or months, with only brief daily visits from Mrs. Whitmore for spiritual counsel. The third stage was reformation. This involved the mysterious treatments administered by Dr. Caldwell. On the third floor, girls selected for reformation were told they were being given a special opportunity to be cleansed of their moral defects through advanced medical science. They were warned that the process would be painful but that their suffering would ultimately lead to spiritual rebirth. Most girls who underwent reformation emerged as hollow shells of their former selves. They followed orders without question, spoke only when spoken to, and showed no interest in the world around them. Thornfield proudly displayed these girls to visitors as examples of successful moral rehabilitation. But not every girl was broken by the system. Some found ways to resist, to maintain their sense of self, and even to document what was happening to them. Their stories would become crucial to understanding the true nature of Redemption Farm and the events that led to its fiery destruction. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Duncan, though the staff at Redemption Farm only ever called her number 47. She was 15 years old when she arrived in the spring of 1885. Committed by her stepfather for what the intake form described as willful disobedience and inappropriate reading material. The inappropriate materials in question were novels by Charles Dickens and George Eliot, books that her stepfather deemed unsuitable for a young woman of good breeding. Sarah's real crime, however, was her intelligence. She could read and write better than most of the men in her rural Missouri community, and she had the dangerous habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. At Redemption Farm, Sarah's intelligence made her a target. She was immediately classified as fundamentally corrupted and assigned to Dormitory C. But her keen mind also made her something else, a witness. And witnesses, as Thornfield would learn too late, can be far more dangerous than rebels. From her first day at the farm, Sarah began to observe and remember. She noticed patterns in the staff's behavior, inconsistencies in their stories, and details that others missed. Most importantly, she began to develop a system for secretly recording what she witnessed. The inspiration came from her grandmother, who had taught her to embroider as a child. Sarah realized that needlework, which was encouraged at the farm as a proper feminine occupation, could be used to encode information. Using threads pulled from her bedding and clothing, she began to stitch a hidden record of life at Redemption Farm. The system she developed was ingenious in its simplicity. Different colored threads represented different people. Blue for Thornfield, red for Mrs. Whitmore, black for Dr. Caldwell. Different stitching patterns indicated different types of events. Straight lines for routine activities, zigzag patterns for punishments, knots for disappearances. She sewed these coded messages into the hems of her clothing, the edges of her bedding, and even into the samplers that the girls were required to make during their domestic instruction hours. But Sarah's most important creation was a detailed map of the farm, stitched onto a piece of cloth that she kept hidden in her mattress. This map showed not just the layout of the buildings, but also secret passages, hidden rooms, and burial sites that she had observed during her 3 years at the facility. The map revealed the true scope of Thornfield's operation. Beyond the main building and the agricultural areas that visitors saw, there were numerous hidden facilities scattered across the property. A small building near the eastern edge of the farm that Sarah labeled as the nursery housed pregnant girls whose babies were taken away immediately after birth. Another structure, half buried in a hillside and marked as the laboratory, was where Caldwell conducted his most extreme experiments. Most chilling of all was an area in the northwestern corner of the property that Sarah marked simply as the garden. This appeared to be a carefully tended plot of land where various plants were grown, but Sarah's notations indicated that the soil was fertilized with more than just manure. Her embroidered symbols suggested that this was where the farm disposed of girls who died during treatment. Sarah's documentation efforts weren't limited to maps and codes. She also managed to preserve physical evidence of the abuse occurring at the farm. When girls were injured during punishments or medical procedures, Sarah would save small pieces of blood-stained cloth or bandages. When strange chemicals were used in the treatments, she would collect residue from discarded bottles or equipment. All of these items were carefully wrapped and hidden in various locations around the farm. Perhaps most remarkably, Sarah managed to maintain contact with the outside world. Despite the farm's strict isolation policies, she discovered that one of the delivery drivers who brought supplies to the farm was sympathetic to the girls' plight. Through a carefully orchestrated system of coded messages hidden in laundry and food deliveries, she was able to send information about conditions at the farm to abolitionists and women's rights activists in Kansas City and St. Louis. These contacts were crucial because they provided independent verification of Sarah's claim. When authorities later dismissed reports about abuse at Redemption Farm as hysterical fantasies, investigators could point to contemporary letters and newspaper articles that corroborated the allegations. Sarah's influence extended beyond documentation. She became a leader among the girls, helping them maintain their sanity and sense of identity in the face of systematic dehumanization. She taught other girls her coding system, creating a network of secret record keepers who could preserve evidence even if she herself was discovered. She also organized acts of subtle resistance that helped the girls maintain their dignity and hope. When Dr. Caldwell required girls to take his experimental compounds, Sarah taught them techniques for secretly spitting out or vomiting the substances. When Miss Whitmore demanded public confessions of imaginary sins, Sarah coached the girls on how to protect their psychological well-being by mentally separating their true selves from the words they were forced to speak. Most importantly, Sarah never stopped planning for escape, not just physical escape from the farm, but the eventual escape of truth from the web of lies and cover-ups that protected the institution. She understood that she might not survive to tell her story herself, but she was determined to ensure that the evidence would survive even if she did. This determination would prove prophetic. In the fall of 1888, Sarah was selected for Dr. Caldwell's most extreme experimental protocol, a procedure he called neural reconstruction, that involved drilling holes in the skull and applying electrical current directly to brain tissue. The procedure was intended to permanently destroy her capacity for independent thought and resistance. Sarah never recovered from the neural reconstruction, but in the days before the procedure, she managed to complete her most important work, a comprehensive written account of everything she had witnessed at Redemption Farm, sewn into the lining of a quilt that she gave to a younger girl named Mary Patterson. Mary would carry that quilt with her when she escaped from the farm 3 years later, and Sarah's testimony would eventually play a crucial role in exposing the truth about Thornfield's crime. But before that could happen, Redemption Farm would face its ultimate test, the investigation that finally pushed Thornfield and his associates to desperate measures. Not every girl who entered Redemption Farm was destined for the documented horrors of Dr. Caldwell's laboratory or Miss Whitmore's disciplinary chambers. Some disappeared much more quietly, vanishing into what the staff euphemistically called specialized placement programs. These were the girls who posed the greatest threat to Thornfield's carefully constructed facade, those who were too intelligent, too strong-willed, or too well-connected to be openly brutalized without risking exposure. They required a different kind of elimination, one that left no obvious trail for investigators to follow. The system worked through a network of affiliated institutions across the Midwest, all connected by shared ideological commitments and financial arrangements. When a girl at Redemption Farm proved too difficult to control through conventional means, she would be quietly transferred to one of these partner facilities under the pretext of receiving specialized care for her particular moral defect. The transfers were documented in a separate set of records, coded in language that obscured their true purpose. A girl who was becoming a leadership figure among the other inmates might be transferred for treatment of excessive independence syndrome. One who had managed to maintain contact with the outside world might be sent away for correction of communicative disorders. Those who showed signs of documenting or remembering the abuse they witnessed were diagnosed with historical fixation syndrome and transferred to facilities specializing in memory modification. But the most sinister transfers were reserved for girls who had committed the ultimate sin in Thornfield's eyes, those who had successfully resisted his efforts to break their spirit. These girls were classified as genetically incorrigible and marked for what the records euphemistically called permanent specialized placement. The destination for these transfers was a facility in the Kansas Territory known as the Clearwater Sanitarium. Officially, Clearwater was a private hospital for the treatment of nervous disorders in young women. In reality, it was the final destination for girls who had proven immune to conventional methods of moral correction. The existence of Clearwater wasn't discovered until 1994, when a routine archaeological survey of a proposed shopping center uncovered the remains of what appeared to be a large institutional burial ground. Subsequent investigation revealed that the site had once housed a facility that operated from 1881 to 1980. No official records of Clearwater's operations survived, but the archaeological evidence told a disturbing story. The burial ground contained the remains of 300. Analysis of the bones revealed evidence of systematic malnutrition, untreated diseases, and injuries consistent with physical restraint and experimental medical procedures. Most troubling of all, many of the skeletons showed signs of surgical intervention that seemed to serve no therapeutic purpose. Holes had been drilled in skulls, limbs had been amputated and reattached, and reproductive organs had been removed through procedures that left distinctive scarring on pelvic bone. The connection between Clearwater and Redemption Farm was established through a series of coded telegrams, discovered in the papers of a defunct Kansas railroad company. These messages, dating from 1885 to 1902, documented regular shipments of special cargo from Jasper County, Missouri to the Clearwater facility. The shipments were always small, never more than 5 or 6 items at a time, and they were consistently described in language that suggested human rather than material cargo.
One telegram from October 1887 read, "Shipment of 6 units arriving Tuesday, 3 marked for immediate processing, 2 for extended observation, 1 for experimental protocol 7. Payment as arranged." Another, from March 1891, Unit 23 proving resistant to standard methods. Recommend transfer to Kansas facility for advanced intervention, usual compensation plus experimental surcharge. The most chilling message was dated November 12, 1902, just 3 days before the fire that destroyed Redemption Farm, liquidating all remaining inventory. Final shipment of 12 units departing immediately. Discontinue all future arrangements per agreement. This final telegram helped explain one of the most puzzling aspects of the Redemption Farm fire, the fact that 12 girls who had been present at the facility, just days before the blaze, were never found among the survivors or victims. According to official records, these girls had been transferred to other facilities for continued care, but no documentation of such transfers was ever produced. The archaeological evidence from Clearwater suggested a different explanation. Analysis of the burial site revealed that the most recent interments had occurred in late 1902, around the time that Redemption Farm was being prepared for closure. Bone analysis indicated that these final victims had died not from disease or accident, but from deliberate poisoning with arsenic compounds. It appeared that when Thornfield realized his operation was about to be exposed, he had made arrangements to eliminate the most dangerous witnesses. The 12 girls who vanished before the fire weren't transferred to safety. They were murdered to ensure their silence. But even in death, these invisible girls found ways to bear witness to their fate. Hidden among the bones at Clearwater, archaeologists discovered small metal objects that had been sewn into the girls' clothing before burial. These objects, when cleaned and analyzed, proved to be coded identification tags that corresponded to Sarah Duncan's hidden records from Redemption Farm. The tags confirmed that the girls buried at Clearwater were indeed transfers from Thornfield's facility, and they provided crucial evidence linking the two institutions in a conspiracy that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of supposedly respectable citizens. Perhaps most remarkably, one of the tags was found to contain a hollow space with a tiny rolled-up piece of paper inside. The paper, when carefully unrolled and examined under a microscope, contained a message written in Sarah Duncan's distinctive coding system. "They cannot kill the truth. We are not forgotten. Our stories live in the threads." This message would prove prophetic in ways that Sarah could never have imagined, because while Thornfield and his associates had succeeded in silencing the voices of their victims, they had not succeeded in erasing the evidence of their crime. That evidence, carefully preserved by girls like Sarah, would eventually emerge to ensure that justice, however delayed, would finally be served. The true scope of the conspiracy surrounding Redemption Farm only became apparent in the decades following its destruction, as investigators began to uncover the extensive network of individuals and institutions that had enabled Thornfield's operation. At the center of this network was an organization known as the American Society for Moral Hygiene, founded in 1878 by a group of physicians, clergymen, and social reformers, who believed that the future of the nation depended on controlling the reproduction of undesirable population. The society operated through a network of affiliated institutions across the country, each specializing in different aspects of what they called population improvement.
Redemption Farm was just one node in this network, serving as a collection and processing center for young women deemed genetically or morally unfit for reproduction. The farm's role was to identify girls who could be rehabilitated through conventional means and separate them from those who required more extreme intervention. The rehabilitation process wasn't about moral improvement in any meaningful sense. It was about creating compliant domestic servants and factory workers who could be trusted not to reproduce undesirable traits. Girls who successfully completed the program were typically placed in situations where they would remain under close supervision for the rest of their lives, often as unpaid domestic help in the homes of society members. Those who couldn't be rehabilitated faced a different fate. They were transferred to specialized facilities like Clearwater, where experimental procedures were used to test theories about genetic modification, behavior control, and population management. The knowledge gained from these experiments was shared among society members and used to refine techniques that were eventually applied on a much larger scale. The financial arrangements that supported this network were complex and carefully conceived. Funding came from a combination of state appropriations, private donations, and what the society euphemistically called efficiency dividends, profits generated by the unpaid labor of institutionalized girls and women. The labor program at Redemption Farm was particularly profitable. The girls worked in agricultural production, textile manufacturing, and domestic services that generated substantial revenue for the institution. They also served as test subjects for agricultural and medical experiments that produced valuable research data sold to universities and corporations. But the most lucrative aspect of the operation was the selective breeding program. Girls who were deemed genetically suitable but morally defective were used in controlled reproduction experiments designed to test theories about inherited behavior patterns. The children produced by these experiments were either adopted by society members or used in further research. The breeding program was managed through a subsidiary organization called the Rural Genetics Research Foundation, which maintained detailed records of bloodlines, genetic characteristics, and experimental outcomes. These records, discovered in a vault beneath a demolished Chicago office building in 2001, revealed that the program had produced over 200 children during its operation from 1883 to 19. The children were classified according to their experimental value and treated accordingly. Those who showed desired traits were raised in carefully controlled environments and eventually integrated into society as demonstration subjects, living proof of the effectiveness of selective breeding technique. Those who exhibited undesirable characteristics were used in further experiments or quietly eliminated. The scope of this program extended far beyond Redemption Farm itself. Similar operations were conducted in institutions across the country, all coordinated by the American Society for Moral Hygiene and funded through the same network of public and private sources. The society's influence reached into the highest levels of government, academia, and religious leadership. Members included state legislators, who crafted laws enabling forced institutionalization, judges who committed girls to the facilities, physicians who developed experimental procedures, and ministers who provided religious justification for the entire enterprise. This network of influence was crucial to maintaining the secrecy that protected the operation. When occasional reports of abuse surfaced, they were quickly suppressed through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and institutional pressure. Journalists who investigated too closely found their sources discredited and their publications facing economic retaliation. Social workers who raised concerns were transferred to other positions or dismissed outright. The network also had international connections. The American Society for Moral Hygiene maintained correspondence with similar organizations in Europe, particularly in Germany, where theories of racial hygiene were being developed and tested. Knowledge and techniques were shared across national boundaries, creating a global movement dedicated to what its members saw as the scientific improvement of the human race. This international dimension helps explain some of the more sophisticated aspects of the experimental programs conducted at facilities like Redemption Farm. The surgical procedures, chemical treatments, and psychological manipulation techniques used by Dr. Caldwell were based on research being conducted simultaneously in European laboratories. The Society's ultimate goal was nothing less than the transformation of human reproduction from a natural process to a managed system, controlled by scientific and social elite. They envisioned a future in which genetic defects would be eliminated, moral behavior would be ensured through biological modification, and social problems would be solved through the simple expedient of preventing the wrong kinds of people from being born. From this perspective, the girls at Redemption Farm weren't victims. They were obstacles to human progress that needed to be removed as efficiently and quietly as possible. The fact that they suffered and died in the process was regrettable but necessary, like the pain of surgery that ultimately saves a patient's life. This ideology of sacrificial progress would prove crucial to understanding the events that led to the fire at Redemption Farm, because when the network of silence began to break down in the early 1900s, the society's leaders decided that some sacrifices were too dangerous to allow, and that complete elimination was preferable to the risk of exposure. By 1901, the carefully constructed facade that protected Redemption Farm was beginning to crumble. The network of silence that had shielded Thornfield's operation for over 2 decades was facing pressures that even its powerful supporters couldn't entirely suppress. The first crack in the armor came from an unexpected source, a newly appointed state inspector of charitable institutions, named Margaret O'Sullivan. Unlike her predecessors, who had conducted perfunctory visits and filed glowing reports about the farm's operations, O'Sullivan was a trained social worker with extensive experience investigating institutional abuse. O'Sullivan's appointment was itself a result of changing political currents. The progressive movement was gaining strength across the country, bringing with it demands for transparency in government operations and protection for vulnerable populations. Reformers were beginning to question the effectiveness of institutions like Redemption Farm, and to demand evidence that they were actually serving their stated purposes. O'Sullivan's initial visit to the farm in March 1901 was hailed as a routine inspection, but she immediately noticed discrepancies that aroused her suspicions. The girls she was shown were unusually passive and uniform in their responses, suggesting they had been carefully coached. The facilities that were presented for her review were suspiciously clean and well appointed, unlike the typical conditions she observed at similar institutions. Most importantly, O'Sullivan noticed that the number of girls present during her visit didn't match the enrollment figures in the official records. According to the documents, the farm housed 127 girls, but she counted only 89 during. When she asked about the discrepancy, Thornfield explained that some girls were working in distant fields, and others were receiving medical treatment in isolated quarters. O'Sullivan requested to visit these areas, but was told that infectious diseases made such visits inadvisable. She was shown medical certificates supposedly documenting outbreaks of tuberculosis and scarlet fever, but the documents appeared freshly prepared and contained inconsistencies that suggested they had been hastily fabricated. Determined to uncover the truth, O'Sullivan arranged for an unannounced follow-up visit in May 1901. This time, she brought with her a deputy sheriff and a physician from the state health department. The inspection team arrived at dawn, before the staff could prepare their usual presentation. What they found was dramatically different from the scenes that had been staged for previous visitors. The girls were housed in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Many showed signs of malnutrition and physical abuse. Several appeared to be under the influence of narcotics, responding slowly to questions and displaying the glassy-eyed stare that O'Sullivan recognized as a symptom of chronic drugging. Most disturbing of all, the inspection team discovered the isolation cells in the basement and the experimental facilities on the 3rd floor. Caldwell's laboratory contained equipment that had no legitimate medical purpose, including electrical devices that appeared designed to inflict pain rather than provide treatment. The team also uncovered evidence of the disposal system that had been used to hide evidence of deaths at the facility. Behind the main building, they found partially buried remains of what appeared to be medical waste, including human tissue and organs that suggested illegal surgical procedures had been conducted on the premises. O'Sullivan's report, filed with the state government in June 1901, documented these findings in meticulous detail, and recommended immediate closure of the facility and criminal prosecution of its operators. The report should have triggered a major investigation, and brought the entire network of abuse to light. Instead, it disappeared. Within days of filing her report, O'Sullivan was informed that her position was being eliminated due to budget constraints. The deputy sheriff who had accompanied her was transferred to a remote posting on the state's western border. The physician from the health department was reassigned to other duties and warned not to discuss his observations at Redemption Farm, but the damage had been done. Word of O'Sullivan's discoveries had begun to spread through the network of progressive activists and women's rights advocates, who had been monitoring conditions at institutions like Redemption Farm. Newspapers in Kansas City and St. Louis began investigating the allegations. Despite pressure from advertisers and political figures to drop the story, the coverage was initially limited and cautious, focusing on general concerns about institutional conditions, rather than specific allegations of criminal abuse.
Initially tried to discredit Patterson's testimony, claiming she was mentally unstable and motivated by spite against the institution that had tried to help her. But Patterson wasn't the only survivor willing to speak out. Other former inmates began coming forward with their own stories, creating a chorus of testimony that became impossible to dismiss. The coded documentation that Sarah Duncan had preserved provided physical evidence that supported the survivors' accounts,
and revealed the full scope of the abuses that had been committed. By October 1901, the pressure for investigation had become irresistible. A grand jury was convened in Jasper County to examine the allegations against Redemption Farm, and subpoenas were issued for Thornfield, his staff, and various supporters who had been involved in the facility's operations. This was the moment when the network of silence faced its greatest test. The powerful individuals who had protected Thornfield's operation for over 20 years now had to decide whether to sacrifice him to protect themselves or to risk exposure by continuing their support. They chose a third option: elimination. On November 10, 1902, just days before Thornfield was scheduled to testify before the grand jury, he received a visit from representatives of the American Society for Moral Hygiene. The details of their conversation were never recorded, but the outcome was clear. Within 72 hours, the remaining girls at Redemption Farm had been transferred to other facilities. Key documents had been removed from the premises, and the stage had been set for the fire that would destroy all remaining evidence of the crimes that had been committed there. The visitors who came to see Thornfield that night weren't offering him protection or support. They were delivering an ultimatum: ensure that no evidence survived to connect the society to the abuses at Redemption Farm, or face consequences that would be far worse than anything the legal system might impose. Thornfield understood the message. He had been useful to the society for over 20 years, but now he had become a liability that threatened to expose the entire network. His choice was to cooperate in his own destruction, or to risk the kind of permanent elimination that had been visited upon the girls who had posed similar threats to the operation. He chose cooperation, but with a twist that his handlers hadn't anticipated. Because Thornfield had his own insurance policy, documentation that could implicate every member of the society in the crimes that had been committed at Redemption Farm. If he was going to be sacrificed to protect the network, he was determined to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge to destroy his betrayers. The fire that consumed Redemption Farm on November 5th, but it wasn't the simple elimination of evidence that the society had planned. It was Thornfield's final act of defiance, a carefully orchestrated destruction that preserved crucial evidence while appearing to destroy it, ensuring that justice would eventually be served even if it took decades to arrive. November 15, 1902, dawned gray and cold across Jasper County, Missouri. The first snow of winter had fallen the night before, leaving a thin white blanket over the grounds of Redemption Farm. To any casual observer, the facility appeared to be operating normally, smoke rising from chimneys, staff moving about their duties, the usual rhythm of institutional life continuing unchanged. But beneath the surface, everything was different. The dormitories that had once housed over 100 girls now stood largely empty. The workshops and fields that had buzzed with forced labor were silent. Most tellingly, the third-floor laboratory where Dr. Caldwell had conducted his experiments had been stripped bare, its equipment and records removed under cover of darkness over the previous 3 nights. The few remaining residents, 12 girls who had been deemed too dangerous to transfer elsewhere, were being held in the basement isolation cells. These were the girls who had been marked for permanent elimination, the final witnesses whose silence needed to be ensured before the facility could be safely destroyed. But unknown to the staff, these girls weren't as helpless as they appeared. During their years at the farm, they had learned Sarah Duncan's techniques for resistance and documentation. They had maintained contact with each other through coded messages, and had developed their own plans for survival. The leader of this group was a 17-year-old named Elizabeth Morse, who had arrived at the farm in 1899 after being committed for what her intake file described as excessive intellectual development and unwomanly independence. Elizabeth had been one of Sarah's protégés, learning not only the coding system but also the broader philosophy of resistance that Sarah had developed. Elizabeth understood that the unusual activity at the farm over the past few days meant that something dramatic was about to happen. She had observed the removal of equipment and documents, noted the departure of most of the other girls, and recognized the signs of an operation being wound down. Most ominously, she had overheard conversations between staff members that suggested the remaining girls were not intended to survive whatever was planned. Working with the other girls in the isolation cells, Elizabeth had spent the previous weeks preparing for this moment. They had collected materials that could be used to start fires, identified escape routes from the basement, and established signals for coordinated action. Most importantly, they had prepared their own documentation of the crimes committed at the farm, using threads pulled from their clothing to create a coded record that could survive even if they didn't. The plan that Elizabeth and her companions had developed was both desperate and brilliant. They would use the fact that their captors were planning to destroy the facility against them, starting their own fires that would create confusion and provide cover for escape. But they would be careful to preserve the evidence that could later be used to expose the truth about what had happened at Redemption Farm. The operation began at sunset, when the staff was distracted by their own preparations for arson. Elizabeth and her companions had spent months loosening the locks on their cell doors and preparing the materials they would need for their own fires. As darkness fell, they put their plan into action. The first flames appeared in the laundry room, where Elizabeth had hidden combustible materials collected over several weeks. The fire spread quickly through the building's wooden interior, creating the diversion that the girls needed to escape from their cells and begin their own operation. But instead of simply fleeing, the girls moved through the building systematically, starting additional fires in strategic locations while carefully preserving key pieces of evidence. They knew where Thornfield kept his private records, where Dr. Caldwell had hidden his research notes, and where Mrs. Whitmore stored the disciplinary logs that documented years of abuse. Working with remarkable coordination and courage, they managed to remove these materials from the building before the flames could reach them. The documents were hidden in pre-prepared locations around the farm property, wrapped in waterproof materials and buried in places that would be safe from the fire but accessible to future investigators. Most remarkably, the girls also managed to rescue some of the evidence that Sarah Duncan had hidden years earlier. Using information from Sarah's coded maps, they located several caches of documentation that had been secreted in various locations around the facility. These materials were added to their own collection and hidden in separate locations to ensure their survival. The official investigation that followed the fire concluded that the blaze had been started by an electrical malfunction in the main building's aging wiring system. The investigators found no evidence of arson, and no indication that the fire had been anything other than a tragic accident. The 12 girls who had been residents at the time of the fire were listed as victims who had been overcome by smoke before they could escape from the building. But the girls had survived, and they had succeeded in preserving the evidence that would eventually expose the truth about Redemption Farm. In the chaos of the fire and its aftermath, they had managed to escape from the property and make their way to sympathetic contacts in the surrounding communities. The network of support that helped them was largely composed of local farmers and townspeople who had long suspected that something was wrong at the farm, but had been powerless to act against such a well-protected institution. When the surviving girls appeared at their doors with stories of abuse and evidence of criminal activity, these ordinary citizens proved willing to risk their own safety to help bring the truth to light. The evidence that the girls had preserved was carefully distributed among multiple hiding places to ensure its survival. Some was buried on private property owned by sympathetic farmers. Other documents were hidden in churches and community buildings. The most important materials were entrusted to individuals who could be counted on to preserve them until the time was right for public revelation. This network of ordinary heroes would prove crucial to the eventual exposure of the crimes committed at Redemption Farm, because while the powerful individuals who had supported the institution were able to suppress official investigations and control media coverage in the immediate aftermath of the fire, they could not reach into every farmhouse and church basement where evidence was being quietly preserved. The girls who had orchestrated this remarkable operation scattered to different parts of the country, taking new names and building new lives, but they remained in contact with each other and with the network of supporters who had helped them escape. They understood that their survival was only the first step in a longer campaign for justice that might take decades to complete. Elizabeth Morse, the leader of the group, eventually settled in California, where she became a teacher and women's rights activist. She never spoke publicly about her experiences at Redemption Farm, but she maintained detailed correspondence with historians and investigators who were working to document the crimes that had been committed there. In her final letter, written shortly before her death in 1963, Elizabeth reflected on the night of the fire and its aftermath. "We knew that if we didn't act, the truth would die with us, but we also knew that if we did act, we might not live to see justice done. We chose to trust in the future, to believe that someday people would care enough about the truth to seek it out and act upon it. I hope we were right." Elizabeth's hope would prove to be justified, but it would take many more decades before the full truth about Redemption Farm would finally be revealed. The years following the fire at Redemption Farm were marked by a systematic campaign to erase any memory of what had happened there. The network of powerful individuals who had supported the institution used their influence to suppress investigations, silence witnesses, and ensure that the story of the farm's crimes would disappear from public consciousness. The first step in this campaign was the manipulation of official records. The grand jury that had been investigating the farm at the time of the fire was quietly disbanded, with its members sworn to secrecy about any evidence they had uncovered. The transcripts of their proceedings were sealed and eventually destroyed, along with most other official documents related to the facility. The site of the farm itself was quickly purchased by a shell company controlled by members of the American Society for Moral Hygiene. The burned ruins were demolished and the land was converted to conventional agricultural use, with no markers or memorials to indicate what had once stood there. The new owners made it clear that trespassers would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, effectively preventing casual investigation of the site. Media coverage of the fire and its aftermath was carefully managed through a combination of economic pressure and social influence. Newspapers that had been investigating the farm found themselves facing advertising boycotts and subscription cancellations, organized by supporters of the institution. Editors who had been sympathetic to the survivors' stories were replaced by individuals more willing to accept the official version of events. Most effectively, the network worked to discredit the survivors themselves. Mary Patterson, whose testimony had first exposed the abuses at the farm, found herself the target of a whisper campaign that portrayed her as mentally unstable and prone to fantasies. Her employment opportunities disappeared, her friends and associates were pressured to distance themselves from her, and she eventually retreated into isolation and poverty. Other survivors faced similar treatment. Those who had spoken publicly about their experiences were portrayed as unreliable witnesses, seeking attention or compensation. Their stories were dismissed as exaggerations or outright fabrications motivated by spite against an institution that had tried to help them. The campaign was so effective that within 5 years of the fire, Redemption Farm had largely disappeared from public memory. Newspaper archives were purged of articles about the controversy, official records were destroyed or sealed, and the few remaining witnesses were too intimidated or marginalized to continue speaking out. But the silence wasn't complete. The evidence that Elizabeth Morse and her companions had preserved continued to exist, hidden in the network of supporters who had helped them escape. These documents and artifacts were carefully maintained by individuals who understood their historical importance, even if they couldn't safely reveal them to the public. The preservation network operated through families, churches, and community organizations that had been touched by the farm's victim. When an original custodian died or became unable to continue their guardianship, the materials were passed on to trusted individuals who would continue the work of preservation. This underground network faced constant pressure from the forces that wanted the evidence destroyed. Homes were burglarized, churches were vandalized, and individuals who were suspected of possessing incriminating materials found themselves the targets of intimidation and harassment. Several custodians died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths ruled accidents or suicides despite evidence suggesting foul play. But the network adapted and survived. The evidence was divided into smaller caches and distributed more widely, making it impossible for any single action to destroy the entire collection.
Coded messages and secret meetings were used to coordinate preservation efforts and share information about threats to the evidence. Perhaps most importantly, the network began to recruit new members from among historians, journalists, and activists who were dedicated to exposing historical injustices. These individuals brought professional skills and institutional resources to the preservation effort, helping to ensure that the evidence would not only survive, but eventually be properly analyzed and presented to the public. The turning point came in the 1960s, when the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement created a new cultural climate that was more receptive to stories of institutional abuse and systematic oppression. Historians began to re-examine the progressive era's reform institutions, uncovering patterns of abuse and control that had been hidden or ignored by earlier generations of scholars. It was during this period of historical re-examination that the first pieces of evidence from Redemption Farm began to surface in academic contexts. A historian researching the eugenic movement found references to the farm in the papers of prominent supporters. A women's studies scholar discovered testimony from survivors in the archives of early feminist organizations. An investigative journalist uncovered connections between the farm and other institutions that had been exposed for similar abuses. These discoveries created a new momentum for investigation, but they also triggered renewed efforts by the network of silence to suppress the evidence. Legal challenges were filed to prevent publication of sensitive materials. Researchers found themselves facing threats and intimidation when they probed too deeply into the farm's history. Academic institutions were pressured to discourage investigation of the topic. The most significant breakthrough came in 1978, when Elizabeth Morse's personal papers were donated to a university archive by her estate. Morse had died 15 years earlier, but she had left detailed instructions for the eventual release of her materials, once enough time had passed to ensure the safety of other survivors and their descendants. The papers included not only Morse's own testimony about her experiences at the farm, but also maps and coded keys that revealed the locations where evidence had been hidden after the fire.
This information allowed researchers to begin systematic recovery of the materials that had been preserved for over 70 years. The process of recovery was slow and dangerous. Many of the original hiding places had been discovered and emptied by hostile forces over the decade. Others had been lost to development or natural disasters. But enough material survived to begin reconstructing the full scope of what had happened at Redemption Farm. The evidence that emerged painted a picture of systematic abuse that was even more extensive and horrifying than the early investigators had suspected. The documents revealed not only the individual crimes committed at the farm, but also the broader network of institutions and individuals that had supported and enabled those crimes. Most importantly, the evidence provided detailed information about the disposal methods that had been used to hide the farm's victims. Using this information, investigators were able to identify burial sites and begin the process of recovering and identifying the remains of girls who had died at the facility. The first excavations began in 1985. Nearly a century after the farm had opened its doors. What they found would finally provide the physical evidence needed to corroborate the testimony of survivors and bring the full truth about Redemption Farm to light. The team of archaeologists and forensic specialists, who arrived at the former site of Redemption Farm in the summer of 1985, faced a challenge that was both scientific and moral. Their task was to recover evidence of crimes that had been committed nearly a century earlier, but they were also working to restore dignity to victims who had been deliberately erased from history. The excavation was led by Dr. Tricia Whitfield, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Missouri, who had specialized in the investigation of historical atrocities. Whitfield understood that the work would be controversial and potentially dangerous, given the powerful interests that had worked for decades to suppress evidence of what had happened at the farm. The initial survey of the site was guided by the maps and documentation that Elizabeth Morse had preserved, but the team quickly discovered that the physical landscape had been dramatically altered in the decades since the fire. The original buildings had been demolished and their foundations removed. The agricultural fields had been replanted multiple times, with new irrigation systems and access roads that had disturbed the original topography. Most challenging of all, the team discovered evidence that the site had been systematically searched and altered by unknown parties over the years. Excavation marks suggested that numerous attempts had been made to locate and remove evidence, and several of the burial sites indicated by Morse's maps showed signs of previous disturbance. Despite these obstacles, the team began to uncover artifacts and remains that corroborated the survivors' account. The first major discovery came in September 1985, when excavation near the former location of the main building revealed a foundation wall that had been missed during the original demolition. Hidden within this wall was a metal container that held dozens of documents in remarkable condition. The documents included medical records, experimental protocols, and correspondence that provided detailed evidence of the systematic abuse that had been conducted at the farm. Most importantly, they included lists of names and identification numbers that allowed investigators to begin the process of accounting for the individuals who had been held at the facility. The breakthrough in locating burial sites came when the team applied ground-penetrating radar to areas identified in Morse's maps. The technology revealed numerous subsurface anomalies that suggested the presence of unmarked graves scattered across the property. Careful excavation of these sites began to yield human remains that could be analyzed and potentially identified. The first grave that was fully excavated contained the remains of a young female, approximately 14-16 years old at the time of death. The skeleton showed evidence of numerous healed fractures, suggesting a pattern of physical abuse over an extended period. Most disturbing of all, the skull showed signs of surgical intervention consistent with the experimental procedures described in Dr. Caldwell's research note. Subsequent excavations revealed similar patterns. Of the 43 graves that were ultimately identified and excavated, all contained the remains of young women between the ages of. Many showed evidence of malnutrition, untreated diseases, and injuries consistent with systematic abuse. A significant number showed signs of experimental surgical procedures that had no legitimate medical purpose. The forensic analysis of the remains provided crucial corroboration for the survivors' testimony about the experimental programs that had been conducted at the farm. Bone analysis revealed evidence of mercury poisoning, arsenic exposure, and other chemical contamination that matched the compounds described in Caldwell's research note. Perhaps most remarkably, several of the graves contained artifacts that provided direct links to specific individuals mentioned in the survivors' account. A grave near the former location of the main building contained a small metal object that proved to be a coded identification tag, consistent with Sarah Duncan's documentation system. When the code was deciphered using the keys that Morse had preserved, it revealed the name and arrival date of a girl who had been reported missing from the farm. Another grave contained a small piece of embroidered cloth that matched samples of Sarah Duncan's needlework that had been preserved by other survivors. The embroidery contained coded information about the circumstances of the individual's death, providing evidence that Duncan's documentation system had continued to operate even in the facility's final year. The excavation also revealed evidence of the disposal methods that had been used to conceal the farm's crimes. Several graves contained remains of multiple individuals, suggesting that mass burials had been used during periods of high mortality. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed evidence of lime and other substances that had been used to accelerate decomposition and eliminate traces of the burials. Most chilling of all, the team discovered evidence that some of the graves had been prepared in advance, with coffins and burial supplies stockpiled in hidden locations around the property. This suggested that the deaths at the farm weren't accidental consequences of harsh conditions, but rather planned eliminations that were carried out as part of the facility's operation. The excavation work continued for 3 years, during which time the team recovered the remains of 27 individuals and thousands of artifacts that provided evidence of the systematic abuse that had been conducted at the farm. The work was conducted under conditions of intense secrecy, with team members required to sign confidentiality agreements and security measures implemented to prevent interference by hostile parties. Despite these precautions, the excavation faced numerous challenges from individuals and organizations that wanted to prevent the truth from being revealed. Equipment was vandalized, team members received threats, and legal challenges were filed in attempts to halt the work. On one occasion, the excavation site was sabotaged by unknown parties who destroyed several graves and scattered human remains across the property. But the team persevered, driven by their commitment to restoring dignity to the victims and ensuring that the truth about Redemption Farm would finally be told. The evidence they recovered would form the foundation for criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and historical documentation that would expose the full scope of the crimes that had been committed. The final report of the excavation, published in 1989, provided comprehensive documentation of the systematic abuse and murder that had been conducted at Redemption Farm. The report included detailed forensic analysis of the human remains, chemical analysis of artifacts and soil samples, and correlation of the physical evidence with the documentary materials that had been preserved by survivors. The impact of the report was immediate and dramatic. Long-dormant criminal cases were reopened, civil lawsuits were filed against the estates of the perpetrators and their supporters, and public pressure mounted for full disclosure of the institutional networks that had enabled the crime. But perhaps most importantly, the excavation had finally given voice to the victims who had been silenced for so long. The careful recovery and analysis of their remains, combined with the preservation of their own documentation efforts, ensured that their stories would never again be lost or forgotten. The publication of the excavation report in 1989 marked the beginning of a legal and social reckoning that would continue for decades. The evidence that had been carefully preserved and painstakingly recovered finally provided the foundation for holding accountable those who had perpetrated and enabled the crimes at Redemption Farm. The first legal action came in the form of a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of survivors and the families of victims. The lawsuit named not only the direct perpetrators who were still alive, but also the institutions and organizations that had supported the farm's operation. The plaintiffs sought monetary damages, but more importantly, they demanded full disclosure of the records and documents that could reveal the complete scope of the conspiracy. The legal battle was fierce and protracted. The defendants included wealthy families, prominent institutions, and government agencies that had powerful legal resources at their disposal.
Fought every aspect of the case, challenging the authenticity of evidence, questioning the reliability of survivors' testimony, and arguing that too much time had passed for any meaningful legal action to be taken. But the survivors and their advocates had something their opponents lacked: the truth, carefully documented and preserved through decades of patient effort. The coded records that Sarah Duncan had created, the artifacts that Elizabeth Morse had rescued, and the physical evidence recovered through excavation provided an unshakable foundation for the case. The breakthrough came when the court ordered the release of sealed government records related to the farm's operations. These documents, which had been classified for national security reasons, revealed the extent to which federal agencies had been aware of and complicit in the abuses. The records showed that government officials had not only known about the experimental programs at the farm, but had actively supported them as part of broader research initiatives. The revelations sparked a broader investigation into the network of institutions that had been involved in similar programs across the country. Congressional hearings were held, federal agencies were forced to open their historical files, and a national commission was established to investigate the full scope of institutional abuse in American reform facilities. The commission's work revealed that Redemption Farm was just one node in a vast network of institutions that had operated with government support and funding. Similar facilities had existed in dozens of states,
all conducting experimental programs on vulnerable populations under the guise of rehabilitation and reform. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Thousands of individuals had been subjected to forced sterilization, experimental medical procedures, and psychological torture. Children had been separated from their families and used as test subjects in research programs designed to support theories of racial and genetic superiority. The entire progressive reform movement had been infiltrated and corrupted by individuals who saw vulnerable populations as raw material for their eugenic experiments. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, but eventually resulted in significant victories for the survivors and their family. Financial settlements were reached that provided compensation for the suffering that had been inflicted, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the horrors that had been endured. More importantly, the legal process forced full disclosure of the documentary evidence that had been hidden for so long. Archives were opened, records were declassified, and the complete history of the institutional abuse network was finally made public. The social and cultural impact of these revelations was profound. The faith that Americans had placed in their progressive institutions was shattered by the evidence of systematic abuse and criminal conspiracy. Reform movements were forced to confront their own history and acknowledge the ways in which they had been manipulated by individuals with hidden agendas. Educational curricula were revised to include honest discussions of this dark chapter in American history. Memorials were erected to honor the victims of institutional abuse. Most importantly, new safeguards were implemented to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. The reckoning also had international implications. The evidence from Redemption Farm and similar institutions provided crucial documentation of the American roots of eugenic theory and practice. This evidence was used in war crimes tribunals and truth and reconciliation commissions around the world, helping to establish the historical connections between American eugenic programs and the genocidal policies implemented by fascist regimes. But perhaps the most important aspect of the reckoning was the restoration of dignity and memory to the victims who had been erased from history. The careful preservation of their stories, the respectful recovery of their remains, and the public acknowledgement of their suffering ensured that they would never again be forgotten. Memorial services were held at burial sites where victims had been laid to rest with proper ceremony. Their names were inscribed on monuments that would preserve their memory for future generations. Their stories were collected and published, ensuring that their voices would continue to be heard long after the last survivors had passed away. The network of ordinary citizens who had risked their own safety to preserve evidence and protect survivors was also honored and recognized. Their courage and persistence had made the eventual exposure of the truth possible, demonstrating the power of grassroots resistance against institutional oppression. Elizabeth Morse, who had died before the full truth was revealed, was posthumously recognized as a hero whose leadership and courage had saved countless lives. A scholarship fund was established in her name to support young women pursuing education in social justice and human rights. Sarah Duncan, whose documentation system had preserved crucial evidence of the crimes, was honored with a memorial garden at the site of the former farm. The garden included plants that had been grown from seeds found in her embroidered maps, symbolizing the way in which truth and beauty could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The reckoning was not complete, and many questions remained unanswered. Some perpetrators had died before they could be held accountable, and some evidence had been destroyed beyond recovery. But the fundamental truth about what had happened at Redemption Farm had been established beyond any doubt, and measures had been taken to ensure that similar crimes would never again be allowed to occur in silence. In the decades that followed the exposure of Redemption Farm's crimes, scholars and activists worked to understand the broader implications of what had been revealed. The story of the farm was not just a historical curiosity or an isolated example of institutional abuse. It was a window into fundamental questions about power, authority, and the protection of vulnerable populations that remain relevant today. The academic study of the farm and similar institutions revealed patterns that extended far beyond the specific context of early 20th century reform movement. The combination of progressive rhetoric with regressive practices, the use of scientific language to justify moral atrocities, and the creation of networks of complicity that protected institutional abuse, were recognized as recurring themes throughout American history. Researchers identified similar patterns in the treatment of indigenous populations, the exploitation of immigrant communities, and the abuse of individuals with mental illness and developmental disability. The eugenic theories that had justified the crimes at Redemption Farm were found to have influenced policies ranging from immigration restrictions to forced sterilization programs that continued well into The documentation methods that Sarah Duncan and other survivors had developed became subjects of scholarly study in their own right. Historians and anthropologists recognized these techniques as sophisticated forms of resistance that had preserved crucial evidence under conditions of extreme oppression. The coded embroidery and hidden records were compared to similar documentation efforts by victims of political persecution around the world. The preservation network that had protected evidence of the farm's crimes for decades became a model for contemporary human rights organizations working to document ongoing atrocity. The techniques that ordinary citizens had used to hide and preserve sensitive materials were adapted for use in modern contexts where digital surveillance and sophisticated search methods posed new challenges to evidence preservation. The legal precedents established through the Redemption Farm litigation influenced subsequent cases involving institutional abuse and historical injustices. The principle that no statute of limitations should apply to crimes against humanity, the recognition that systematic destruction of evidence could constitute a continuing conspiracy, and the requirement for full disclosure of government records related to human rights abuses all became important elements of human rights law. Educational institutions began incorporating the story of Redemption Farm into curricula, dealing with ethics, human rights, and the responsible conduct of research. Medical schools used the case to illustrate the importance of informed consent and the dangers of experimental research on vulnerable populations. Social work programs examined the case as an example of how helping professions could be corrupted by ideological extremism and institutional pressure. The memorial sites that were established at the former location of the farm became places of pilgrimage for survivors of institutional abuse and their families. Annual ceremonies were held to honor the victims and to renew commitments to protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation and harm. These gatherings brought together people from diverse backgrounds who shared common experiences of institutional trauma and recovery. The ongoing research into the farm's history continued to yield new discoveries and insights. Archaeological investigations revealed additional burial sites and artifact caches that expanded understanding of the facility's operation. Genetic analysis of recovered remains helped identify victims and reconnect them with surviving family members. Digital restoration techniques were applied to damaged documents, revealing previously illegible text that provided new details about the crimes that had been committed. International collaborations developed as researchers from other countries shared information about similar institutions in their own national context. Comparative studies revealed that the American eugenic movement had been part of a global network of scientific racism that had influenced policies and practices around the world. The evidence from Redemption Farm contributed to broader efforts to document and understand this international conspiracy against human dignity. The story also influenced contemporary policy debates about the treatment of vulnerable populations. Advocates for the rights of children, people with disabilities, immigrants, and other marginalized groups drew on the lessons of Redemption Farm to argue for stronger protections against institutional abuse. The case was cited in congressional hearings, court decisions, and international human rights proceedings as evidence of the need for vigilant oversight of institutions that serve vulnerable populations. Mental health professionals used the case to examine the long-term effects of institutional trauma and to develop more effective treatments for survivors of systematic abuse. The detailed documentation of the survivors' experiences provided insights into resilience, resistance, and recovery that informed therapeutic approaches and policy recommendations. The media coverage of the farm's history also evolved over time, moving from sensationalized exposés to more thoughtful examinations of the systemic factors that had enabled the abuse. Documentaries, books, and articles explored the complex web of social, economic, and political forces that had created the conditions for such crimes to occur and be concealed for so long. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Redemption Farm became a powerful reminder of the importance of bearing witness to injustice and preserving evidence of wrongdoing for future generations. The courage of survivors like Sarah Duncan and Elizabeth Morse, who had risked their lives to document and preserve evidence of crimes, inspired contemporary activists working to expose institutional abuse and hold perpetrators accountable. The technical innovations that had been developed to hide and preserve evidence under extreme conditions were adapted for use in modern human rights documentation efforts. The principles of distributed preservation, coded communication, and community-based protection networks became standard practices for organizations working in repressive environments around the world. The case also highlighted the crucial role that ordinary citizens could play in protecting human rights and preserving historical truth. The farmers, shopkeepers, church members, and community leaders who had risked their safety to help survivors and preserve evidence demonstrated that resistance to institutional oppression did not require special training or resources. It required only moral courage and community solidarity. As the centennial of the farm's destruction approached, new initiatives were launched to ensure that the lessons of Redemption Farm would continue to be taught and remembered. Educational partnerships were established with schools and universities around the world to share the story and its implications for contemporary human rights work. Digital archives were created to preserve and make accessible the vast collection of documents, artifacts, and testimony that had been assembled over the decades of investigation. Interactive exhibits were developed that allowed visitors to explore the evidence and understand the methods that had been used to document and preserve the truth. The story of Redemption Farm had become more than just a historical account of institutional abuse. It had become a template for understanding how systematic oppression operates, how evidence of wrongdoing can be preserved under extreme conditions, and how truth can eventually triumph over even the most powerful conspiracies of silence. Today, more than a century after the flames consumed Redemption Farm, the site where it once stood is marked by a simple granite memorial. The inscription reads, "In memory of those who suffered in silence, and in honor of those who ensured their voices would be heard." Visitors to the memorial often leave flowers, but they also leave something else: red thread, tied to the fence posts and twisted around the memorial itself. These threads, left by survivors of various forms of institutional abuse, create a visible reminder that the legacy of places like Redemption Farm extends far beyond the specific historical moment of their operation. The red thread has become a symbol of resistance, documentation, and memory that connects the girls who suffered at Redemption Farm to contemporary victims of institutional abuse around the world. It represents the principle that truth, once documented and preserved, cannot be permanently suppressed, no matter how powerful the forces that seek to silence it. The story of Redemption Farm teaches us that evil often presents itself in the guise of good intention, that systematic oppression can operate behind facades of reform and rehabilitation, and that the most vulnerable members of society are often the targets of those who seek to impose their vision of human perfectibility through force and deception. But the story also teaches us about the power of resistance, the importance of documentation, and the crucial role that ordinary people can play in preserving truth and protecting the innocent. The girls who developed coding systems, the community members who hid evidence, and the activists who fought for disclosure all demonstrate that individuals can make a difference even when confronting powerful institutional conspiracy. The techniques that Sarah Duncan developed for documenting abuse under conditions of extreme surveillance and control have been adapted and applied in contexts ranging from political prisons to domestic violence shelters. Her insight that documentation could be hidden in plain sight, embedded in seemingly innocent activities, has inspired generations of human rights defenders working in repressive environments. The preservation network that protected evidence of the farm's crimes for decades has become a model for community-based resistance to institutional oppression. The principle that important evidence should be distributed among multiple custodians, hidden in various locations, and protected by overlapping networks of supporters, has been applied to human rights documentation efforts around the world. The legal strategies that were developed to overcome statutes of limitations and force disclosure of government records have influenced human rights litigation for decades. The principle that crimes against humanity cannot be subject to time limits, and that systematic destruction of evidence constitutes a continuing conspiracy, has been applied in cases ranging from war crimes tribunals to civil rights litigation. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Redemption Farm demonstrates the importance of believing survivors, preserving their testimony, and working patiently for justice even when it seems impossible to achieve. The girls who were labeled as delinquents, degenerates, and threats to social order were in fact the keepers of truth who ensured that justice would eventually be served. Their courage in the face of systematic brutality, their ingenuity in developing methods of resistance and documentation, and their determination to preserve evidence for future generations, represent some of the finest examples of human dignity and moral courage in American history. The investigation and prosecution of the crimes at Redemption Farm also revealed the importance of supporting independent journalism, academic research, and grassroots activism as essential safeguards against institutional abuse. The network of scholars, activists, and journalists who worked for decades to expose the truth demonstrated that democracy depends on the existence of independent institutions capable of challenging official narratives and holding powerful interests accountable. The case showed that meaningful accountability for historical injustices requires not just legal proceedings, but also educational initiatives, memorial projects, and ongoing efforts to understand and prevent similar abuse. The transformation of the farm site into a place of memory and learning has created opportunities for dialogue, reflection, and commitment to protecting human rights. As we face contemporary challenges related to institutional abuse, government overreach, and the protection of vulnerable populations, the lessons of Redemption Farm remain urgently relevant. The techniques of resistance and documentation that were developed by the farm's victims can be adapted to address modern forms of oppression and control. The principles of community-based evidence preservation, distributed documentation networks, and patient advocacy for disclosure and accountability provide a framework for responding to contemporary human rights challenges. The story reminds us that truth has a power that transcends the temporary authority of those who seek to suppress it. The memorial at the former site of Redemption Farm includes a visitor center that displays some of the artifacts and documents that were preserved by the survivors and their supporters. But the most powerful exhibit is a simple display case containing samples of Sarah Duncan's embroidered codes, accompanied by the translation keys that allow visitors to read her hidden messages. One of these messages, stitched in red thread on a fragment of grey cloth, reads, "They tried to bury us. They did not know we were seeds." This message captures the essential truth about places like Redemption Farm and the people who suffered there. The forces of oppression and control may seem overwhelming, but they ultimately depend on silence and forgetting to maintain their power. When victims find ways to document their experiences and preserve evidence of abuse, they plant seeds that will eventually grow into movements for justice and accountability. The red threads that visitors leave at the memorial are more than just symbols. They are commitments to continue the work of documentation, preservation, and advocacy that the survivors of Redemption Farm began more than a century ago. They represent promises to believe survivors, support victims, and work for a world in which no one will ever again suffer in silence. The story of Redemption Farm reminds us that evil may be powerful, but truth is eternal. Justice may be delayed, but it cannot be permanently denied. Memory may be suppressed, but it cannot be completely erased. And courage, once demonstrated, becomes a legacy that inspires others across generations and continents. In a world that still struggles with institutional abuse, government secrecy, and the protection of vulnerable populations, the girls of Redemption Farm continue to speak to us through their carefully preserved threads of truth. Their voices call us to vigilance, to courage, and to the patient work of building a more just and humane society. The fire that consumed Redemption Farm on that November night in 1902 was meant to destroy evidence and silence voices. Instead, it became a beacon that continues to illuminate the darkness of institutional oppression and guide those who work for truth and justice. The flames could not consume the threads of red that bound the survivors together, and those threads continue to weave patterns of resistance and hope that will endure as long as there are people willing to remember and act. This is why we tell these stories, not to dwell in darkness, but to light candles that will guide future generations away from the mistakes of the past, and toward a more just and compassionate future. The girls of Redemption Farm planted seeds of truth in soil watered with tears and blood. Our responsibility is to tend those seeds, to help them grow, and to ensure that their harvest will nourish movements for justice for generations to come. Remember their names, honor their courage, continue their work. The threads they left behind are meant to be picked up by other hands, woven into new patterns of resistance and hope, and passed on to those who will come after us in the endless struggle for human dignity and justice. The fire at Redemption Farm was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a legacy that continues to burn bright in the hearts and minds of all who refuse to let truth be buried or forgotten. May their light continue to shine, and may their voices continue to be heard, until justice is finally and completely served.